Kaavya is doing this under duress. But we're very happy to have her to talk about queer literature, queer authors, how life-changing reading books can be. I'd also just like to add that this queer library, which is actually a Lent library, has been curated and put together by Rohini Malu, who's there somewhere here. And Rohini, would you want to say something and introduce Kaavya maybe, and then we can go from there? I think you should anyway. No, I've already.
Okay. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all for those of you who've actually sat and read through some of the books or picked up the scenes. This is a Lent library in that I just sent out a call and I didn't target it at specific places. I targeted my friends, and some of them passed it on, and some of them called me, and complete strangers called me and said, I have books to donate, and they gave me books, which is an act of extreme trust, given that some people don't even dog-ear their books so that they can mark their pages. And they just let it be here for 4 days in the hands of strangers who might have been eating or might have been not washing their hands or any of those things. I'm saying this on day 4 because it's too late to provide now. But one of the downsides of sourcing a library entirely from your friends is that you get the kind of books that you read, and generally in a language that you read. And so if I have more time with this, the next time there will be other languages, there will be more trans fiction, there will be more radical feminism, there will be more valid histories. But as a beginning, it's not too bad. And I want to thank the volunteers for making it look so cute. They put all those little things up, and on day 1 I was afraid we'd only have these many books. But the thing is, everyone is consuming something. And whether they're reading or watching or listening, they're all consuming something. And for those of us who are consuming books, it's hard to get hold of books. And they're getting more expensive as time goes by. And more and more of some kinds of literature is being produced and less. Or perhaps there is more pure fiction being produced, but it's all very expensive. So the sooner we can set up a permanent library that is inclusive and diverse and supportive and radical and sometimes offensive. We don't really have anything offensive here because I said no. But yes, okay, close your back. A real library should have even the crappy stuff and the bad stuff and the offensive stuff. And maybe we can put it in a different shelf that says, don't read this, it's bad. But it should be there. And when we set up a real library that's a reading and lending library, it will include that. But for now, here is Kaavya. Kaavya is going to talk to us about books and queerness.
Hi. Thank you, Rohini, for asking me to speak here, because I'm in no way any kind of expert on queer literature. So if I'm supposed to define it or tell you exactly what it is, I have no idea. I've been thinking about it for 1 week. But what I did do is think about what it meant to be queer and what literature meant to me as a queer person. So I started thinking back a lot. And I realized that the first time I really recognized that I needed help and wanted to read something outside of myself was when I was very heartbroken. So when I was very heartbroken, I needed to find a way to find myself on the page. So I started looking for various texts and various things. And my first heartbreak was a terrible thing because I did all sorts of things wrong. It was a person, there was cheating involved, and there was a teacher involved, and there are not things that were legitimate or sanctioned or right. So then I was facing the question of what is queer literature? What do I have to look for to feel okay that I'm feeling so much pain about this condition that I'm in? So I went back to that moment to think about what I've done ever since, because I don't think it's possible for me to talk about it from up here. I can only talk about it as a reader myself. So the other thing is that I was looking at all the books over here and thinking, have I read enough of them or all of them? And as a queer person, do I have to have read all of these books in order to say something very meaningful about queer literature? So these are the kinds of things I've been thinking about when I was thinking about what to say today. So my first question really is, why do we call it queer literature when we say queer literature? Is it by queer people? And is everything that a queer person is always articulated? Am I always going to write as a queer person when I write about something? And is it about queer people? Is it that you want to see a main character who is in an image of yourself, who is doing things as you want to do or you want to be able to do? So are you looking for permission or sanction or some kind of understanding in reading about someone else? Or is it about not doing things the way everybody else does them? So these are the many things I was considering. And for example, a lot of the literature I've had to read and think about is about family and not necessarily about romantic love or sexuality or sex, and just literally about whether you can have different kinds of connections and interrelationships with different kinds of people and create your own spaces and make your own life. So for me, these are the kinds of things that have been very transformative and very important. And I wanted to make this a conversation, but I don't know which one of you to look at and talk to. So if you have anything to say, it would be nice because I'm quite nervous. So as part of talking today, I was reading a lot of my favorite books or new books or thinking about what books I should talk about. And I picked a handful of them. And I was also looking at, I also wanted to read books that seem very smart about queer literature, so I have a few quotations. And one very nice sentence that I read is from Sarah Ahmed, which is that I have long known that the moment of queer pride is a refusal to be shamed by witnessing the other as being ashamed of you. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this sentence. So I think the most important thing for me is that it is any literature that opens up a sense that you can be whoever you are and whatever you are the things that can be queer literature. So I wanted to just read that out a little bit. I have to think for a minute. So, I picked a handful of books that I have read over time. I have to confess that in a strange way, I feel like because there's always been an anxiety in me to define and understand what queer literature is, I've ended up reading a lot of academic theory and not actually just literature. So I was feeling very ashamed because I can't claim to have read most of these books. So now I think I'll make an effort. But a few books that have been very interesting or definitive or moving or some in various ways is, when I was very young, I read a book called Middlesex. And today I was having a conversation with a friend about, I can't quite remember exactly what happens in the end or what I finally thought about the book. But the most important thing in that text was that it was about a huge family, actually. It was about an immigrant Greek family that comes to the States, and there's a whole race riot, and there's the whole question of the Greek identity that's going on. And somewhere in the middle of that is a person who doesn't know if they're a girl. And that was the first time when I read that book that I thought that kind of utterance could be said aloud and could be considered. And the thing that made it most moving was the fact that it existed along so many axes. It was about the family, it was about race, it was about riots. And all of those things coming together meant that you could think of this person as related to many other parts of themselves and not just their sex and identity and who they turned out to be. But that was an extremely moving book also because it wasn't kind of theorizing through life for you. It was something that you had to feel your way through. So that has been quite definitive. I remember I was quite young when maybe just out of school, so I hadn't thought such a text could exist. And then when I was in college, what ended up happening was that everybody reads The Lihaf by Ismat Chugtai. So there was a lot of people who kept throwing texts like that at you to read them. But then for some reason, I had a range of people who would keep giving me Orlando by Virginia Woolf to read. And I wasn't sure why, because I don't think I figured out what I was by
Behind
then.
you somewhere.
Huh?
There's a copy behind you somewhere.
Yeah?
Because it's seminal, right? You have to read it.
Yeah, so I didn't know if they were giving it to me because I was a literature student, or they thought that there was something going on there that for 300 years later I would be a woman or a man or something like that. And because people kept giving it to me, I refused to read it for a very long time. And then I opened the first few pages, and it's Virginia Woolf, so it's kind of, it tumbles and it goes here and there, and you're not sure who this person is. He's writing poetry in groves and writing to a queen, and it's quite annoying in the beginning until you get into it. So, and then I kind of said, okay, I had this one copy which actually was given to me furtively by this teacher who then broke my heart. And so it was very important and I had to address it. And then someone somewhere else I met also sent me a copy of Orlando. And then later I picked up a copy myself, forgetting about these two things. So this week when I was thinking about it, I happened to pick out that I had 4 copies of Orlando at home, and someone was trying to tell me something. And that was a really interesting experience, because this was people trying to respond to who they thought I was, and that was as interesting as actually reading the book. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other is that quite recently I've been part of a bookstore, and it's a bookstore where we've been thinking about including diverse voices. So Rohini, this is actually very, very beautiful because it outdoes what we've been, I think we're down to like 2 shelves or something like that. But it's been really interesting to think about how you put queer literature amidst a whole ecology of other books. And that has been the most interesting process, which is that we're constantly reshelving things in our store to try and make different themes and addressing different concerns. And sometimes you realize that what you say about queer literature is not simply what I said earlier, which is by queer people, of queer people, about queer themes. But it's also books by Oliver Sacks, who's a person I wanted to spend some time thinking about. Or it's by people who have written about some hormone or some gene or some kind of mental illness or some kind of familial form which is not directly queer. So that has been a very nice opening for me to think about what could we then mean again by queer literature. So one of the things that I considered was the fact that queer literature is always going to be different in different points in time. So I think there's this text over here, I'm not able to find it, but it's called Because I Have a Voice. And I think it's now over a decade old. And the importance of that text then was that you had a group of people from a particular place in Delhi responding to what they thought was a lack in the world and expressing their voice. And so it was a series of essays, it was a series of series of pieces on activism or coming out or meeting other people like yourself and creating knowledge. So there were some academic pieces. But when I picked it up and looked at it, I realized that what it was saying 10 years ago is not necessarily very interesting right now. So what do we mean by queer literature right now? Then there was the fact that a lot of queer literature was talking about the law for a long time. Because in the Indian context, you wanted to constantly respond to being a criminal, not being a criminal. And now that changes again. Does it mean that people will articulate what they want to say differently? And another very important thing is at the Bangalore Queer Film Festival a couple of weeks ago, someone was talking about how they went to the festival because it was basically erotic. And you got to see a lot of nudity on screen. And I just wondered about that. I haven't personally had the relationship with literature where I'm looking for a strong sense of sex or looking for sexual scenes or so on. But then today I picked up My Father's Garden, and I don't know if any of you have picked up this book and read it, but the first few pages are an elaborate sex scene, which is quite fantastically written and quite alluring and arousing even if you don't care for men or dicks or any of that sort. But then as I was reading it, I was thinking about how, and I don't know if this is because I'm illiterate and I haven't done hard enough work to find a book like this, but I don't remember, I haven't seen long pages describing breasts or going down on a woman at least. So then I was thinking about this, which is that do we really when people set out to write whatever they have to write, do they really write about any one of these themes in mind? And is that what I'm interested in when I say queer literature? Because that's just something I was thinking about. So anyway, I just a couple of texts that I have found very, very interesting to dip into, but as I said, kind of very different to me now as a 30-year-old, and would have been very different to me as a 20-year-old, are there are these collections of essays that came out at a point. One is called Yarana, put together by Hoshang Merchant, and the other one is called Facing the Mirror, which is another edited volume. And the fact that they were concerted efforts at a certain point in time, where people had to anthologize a certain kind of writing and bring it together and present it to the world in order to say, this is how it looks if you were to listen to people who are queer and what they say about themselves. And vis-a-vis that, I wonder how we would anthologize queer writing now. What would you do if you had to produce an anthology? Would you talk endlessly about coming out? Is that the only thing? Would you talk about different forms of gender? Would you talk about different ways of living together and creating families? So that's something I was thinking about. And I've also found zines to be really interesting. There's one zine here that the Gezi, I think there were about 6 or 7 of them. And I think that what's really very nice about them is that someone decided to say something about their life as a queer person and ends up making a different set of texts. So then you have a series of photographs. A very dear friend of mine, for example, made a manual for a woman's orgasm and tribbing. So these are not texts that necessarily come together as books and so on, but I found that zines are also really interesting to encounter because you're able to express something very particular about your life that you want to share with somebody. Recently, Rohini was saying something that she wanted me to talk about, and that is the fact that we don't actually have much literature here by Kannada writers. So, for example, there isn't a copy of Mohan Swami in Kannada, for example, considering this is a library in Bangalore and speaking to them. So I was actually thinking about Mohan Swami, which I've read both in Kannada and English. The translation is not very thrilling, but it does an important task, which is that it tells you something that you can feel for this person who has written these essays across his personal life. But if you read Mohan Swami in Kannada, for example, and one of the interesting things is that they were serialized in various magazines and they were published in different places, is that people who read the same thing in Kannada were actually able to recognize themselves on the page and feel somewhat comforted. So apparently Vasudendra got a lot of phone calls from all over different parts of Karnataka saying that I just need to talk to you. So he plays the role of semi-counselor to various gay men from very different milieux than where we are from. And that I think is the most interesting thing I've heard about a queer text in recent times. Even though as literature you could say it's not that well translated, some of the essays are kind of almost nervous and express themselves in a hurried kind of way, almost as though Vasudendra himself is confessing all the time, because Mohan Swami kind of stands in for him. And the relationship of Mohan Swami in the world of Kannada literature, for example, is something that makes me think about how important it is that we write our own stories. So I'm going back to what I was saying, which is that does queer literature have to be only a kind of an extension of our lives, a mirroring of our lives, a comforting of ourselves? And I think yes, it does have to constantly refresh itself and be that for different parts of the world. So I don't know, for example, very much about queer literature in different languages. So I'm not really sure what happens in Hindi. I know that there's a lot of poetry in Hindi that people identify and recognize. So that is something, I'm not sure, I don't know if anybody here has any other texts as references for, like Vasudendra's text, or even if there are other writers in Kannada who are writing about queer things. I'm not aware of that. So, okay, so someone asked if I could give context on Mohan Swami. It's a sort of a series of essays or a novella or a memoir or a biography almost, or autobiography also. It's all of these things at once. Vasudev kind of derives from his own life. And some of them are also fictive, so they're projections of various things that have happened. So the series of stories that he talks about are, some of them are from living as a lonely gay person who doesn't have a partner till he finds Grinder, and then his encounters with various people in the city. And there are other texts about smaller towns where he comes out and then there's a certain violence wrought upon that body because he's sent out of the city, he's beaten and so on. So it's a kind of, almost like a collage of different things that can happen to different people from various milieux. And the idea that if you can't express yourself always as queer, you can't admit always that you're queer, what do you do with yourself? So it kind of adds up into a big picture. And in fact, one of the most moving essays in that essay story in that book is that when you're in school, you fall in love with a friend who's also of the same sex. And then what do you do by the rejection and like when the person finds out or they get a whiff of it, and what happens to you then? So apparently Vasudendra gets a lot of phone calls from people because after the 2009 judgment, I think he came out and the book was circulated extensively and in a more sort of as Vasudendra way. So he actually gets phone calls from people to say, can you please comfort me, or can I meet you, can I talk to you about this because I've never spoken to anybody else about this. So in that sense, I feel like I speak about queer literature from a very comfortable, privileged out, having experienced it in a copious way. So I'm trying to imagine it as somebody who may never have actually thought it was okay to be what you are, to feel as you do, or to go ahead and do something with that. So, which is why I thought about what it meant to me when I first came upon my own first queer heartbreak, because for various reasons I had to hide it, I couldn't tell everybody about it. So there's the fact that you kind of go back into yourself and then you're scared and you're in pain. But how do you tell yourself that it's okay to feel that pain? Just the way that somebody who's broken up with their boyfriend would. And where do you look for it? So then that's the other thing that I was thinking about, which is that when you can't find the perfect text for yourself, because you're never going to, every relationship you have or experience you have is never going to be a templated same-sex relationship or a perfectly contoured gender relationship, is that then you read texts in a way to make them queer for yourself. So that is something that I would do a lot of. So I would read a lot of heartbreak poetry. I can't remember each of the poems, and then you read that poet and that text for yourself and for your, as a kind of consolation for yourself. So that's one of the things that I also consider the act of reading literature. I don't like saying queering literature very much. I'm not fond of that verb form, but I think the act of how you read a text is also then what you make of it. And so one of the things that is talked about a fair bit, but I still think is a very remarkable effort and needs to be done a lot, is the edited volume by Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai, where you take text across time and then you talk about the themes that exist within it. So they're not explicitly queer, they're not self-identifying, they're not proclaiming themselves as such, but they're talking about various forms of desire in different kinds of ways. And I was just talking to Nimi before the talk, about Oliver Sacks' On the Move, and I think I'm going to stop with this because I won't have very much more to say after that. I read Oliver Sacks quite a lot because he writes very, very beautifully about a certain kind of difference in us, which is mental illness, neurological conditions, and you could also say it's a state of being that is other. It's not exactly what you would call quote-unquote normal. And you spend your time reading a lot of Oliver Sacks and understanding schizophrenia or understanding things that you can't possibly imagine, right? When the conditions he describes are so varied and so vast, and he writes about them with great empathy and great compassion. So Nimi was talking about how when she picked up On the Move and learned all about his life, he was a gay man, a very hot gay man, that you're sort of taken aback because on the one hand it's remarkable that he never felt the need to bring that as an explicit condition into that everything he wrote about. But then it makes you wonder, is it one of the reasons or conditions to look at the world with a certain degree of empathy? Is that what enabled him to think about the various people he met with that particular kind of high condition to place on all queer literature, to be very empathetic and very compassionate? But I think that was a very beautiful thing for me also to consider, that when you read On the Move, you see a person up close and you realize, I was actually very happy to think that you didn't think of him as a gay science writer. That's not the only way you think about that person. So I think that is also a very important part of what queer literature can become, that everybody who writes about it needn't only write about romance or love or as a documentary social justice project, but talk about the worlds in which they live and whatever it is that they research, and enrich that world, and perhaps your eye and everything, the way you live, will feed into that and illustrate that. So yes, and of course there's the one book that you have to talk about, which is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. And this is a conversation we've been having at the bookstore about how, and there's also recently N.K. Jemisin. I don't know if any of you have read, is it science fiction?
Fantasy.
It's science fiction. Sorry?
Sort of like
Fantasy.
Speculative.
Speculative science fiction and fantasy, and Octavia Butler. People who are able to build through that form, which is usually about sort of, N.K. Jemisin responds to what she considers very male science fiction and speculative fiction writing, where it's all about the jazz of other planets or metals and different kinds of superpowers in some sense. But all of these women, when they create the worlds they create, are so deftly able to create a very, they're able to talk about gender in these, almost casually. You don't actually realize that she's talking about an androgynous person till you're on the third or fourth chapter. And then in building an androgynous character who is able to bear a child or a thing like that, you're able to bring a certain question to the idea of gender itself. And then later, when probed and questioned and so on, I think there's a really nice quote by Ursula Le Guin where she says that, I think she was, I'm just going to summarize, she was trying to fuck with gender in a particular way because she wanted to see what the world can be if you push it in that direction. And as with N.K. Jemisin, what they do is that they have protagonists who are bisexual or protagonists who are maybe sleeping with men but have some other kind of superpower for which they are oppressed in the world, and they're able to create a world of many different things. So you're not only seeing a man, you're not only seeing a woman, you're also seeing different forms of things that you wouldn't have considered, which is what's exciting about science fiction. So I'm actually revisiting some of these texts and finding it very interesting because you're able to build a world with your ideas, and then you're able to speak about race and representation and identity and all of that. So yeah, this is as much as I had to say, and I just wanted to open the conversation up because I think it's very important to ask what is queer in queer literature and what it means to different people, because I think at some level it's always beautiful when it's personal, and since this is not a definitive session or anything like that. So yeah, so if there's anybody who'd like to respond to what they think is queer, what does queer mean? What do you think queer literature is? And so on.
Show of hands, anyone?
Do you have anything to say?
Look, when Lini contacted me to talk about this, it was a very practical discussion about these are our cost budgets, this is our honorarium budgets, and this is what the time we have, these are our volunteers, etc., etc. So it was a very practical discussion. And her essential question was, will you curate this library for me, or for us? And I said, yeah, I'll discuss all these practical things with you later. And then a few days later, she came and she said, I need a concept note. But my concept note, essentially, from the beginning was, books! This is what happens. And so I can't do this kind of academic talking.
One of our best painters, but best, and for lack of another better word, I use that word. But he has this book of short stories called Foreign Soap, which is written in Gujarati, which is remarkable because it's about the way a bar of soap, a foreign soap, which has been imported from obviously America in the 1980s, travels across different households and becomes the carrier of queer desires. But I just want to, congratulate the Sandbox Collective and everybody involved with this project, and I hope you take it forward because this actually is, I think, the prying open of a very homogeneous narrative of what queer studies constitutes and what queer theory is. And what you said, Kaavya, about needing to speak from our perspectives and our locations, I think is very important. And one of the most enjoyable and I think remarkable books that I have read is by somebody known as Geeta Patel. It's a book called Risky Bodies and Techno Intimacies. And she, of course, talks about Lihaf amongst many other things, including finance and media. But she uses the idea of mayonnaise and the Heisenberg theory of probability to understand Lihaf. Certainty, uncertainty. Yeah, thanks, Roy. My science is not that great, but yeah. But I think the argument she makes is actually about how she found herself being distanced by the term queer and transgender while being an academic in America, and she went back to her own experiences of growing up in Bombay and understanding what Aravni or Kinnari meant, and the particular currencies that these words from Indian languages bring to our sense of what queerness is. So I just want to say that if you do take this forward next year, and I hope you will, there will be a greater kind of addition in terms of our positions in South Asia and in India. For instance, I don't know what Dalit queer literature is. Right? So I think these are the kinds of questions that one might be able to open up.
So I think for me, the book 40 Rules of Love, and it's strange because when you said that what is queer literature, is it written by queer or is it written about a queer character? And then you spoke about how you read a piece of literature and you try and find your own meaning with it. So in 40 Rules of Love, the relationship between Rumi and Shamse Tabriz, and how Shamse Tabriz completely transformed Rumi, and then in that sense was Rumi's whole interpretation of Islam queer, and is Sufism queer, and therefore is that the reason I connect with Sufism, because there are male singers who have fallen in love with a male god and therefore they're singing to the male god. So yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily any of the books on that shelf, but that one book which I connect to is 40 Rules of Love by Elif Shafak.
It's a beautiful book. She describes it so powerfully.
And I went to Konya actually after reading the book, because I was just so mesmerized with it that I actually wanted to see where it all happened.
Someone can we? All right.
Thanks for the talk. So I haven't read much myself, but I came out of curiosity and always looking to read different and new. But I was just thinking that a lot of the narratives that I have read as a student of gender studies maybe 10 years back were about people learning about their sexualities in retrospect. And they were adult narratives. So I was just wondering if there is literature that speaks to children or teenagers, and is it just that it has to be adult fiction, or yeah? So I'd like to know more, because I think that can go a long way for somebody.
This actually excites me because there are two books which I love.
We have this beautiful book right here called Julian is a Mermaid. I can't see it, but here. The boy in this book is somewhere between 6 and 8 years old. There's no sex in it. There is no nudity. But it is simultaneously the queerest and most trans and the most radical thing I've read. Because again, it's about joy, and it's about empathy, and it's about acceptance, and it's about love. So there is a broadening children's literature market. You should talk. I should stop talking.
No, I mean, I don't know that. I mean, I just have two books that I was just discussing with friends this morning. There's this one book called, is it Blue or Red? The crayon, red crayon. The red crayon. I might have spoiled it for you, but it's about a crayon who is the color blue, and he's always drawing, and it's always red when he draws, and his whole life is spent trying to be a blue crayon, and it takes a long time for him to work out that he's actually a red crayon. And so it's a children's book, and it's a book that speaks to many different things, which is why I think it also talks about how do you find out who you are. It might not just be gender or sexuality, so it speaks to different kinds of people. But it's very small, it's absolutely exquisite, and it's actually very painful in a way to read. It's very moving. So there's a lot of children's, and there's also a story of two penguins who fell in love and raised a small penguin together. It's called Three to Tango, and this is a story of actual penguins in a zoo who were allowed to live together and rear a small penguin. What are small penguins called? But yes, there's a lot of very beautiful, in fact, and I find actually, and as everyone was speaking, I realized that it's impossible to talk about this thoroughly or anything, but what's very beautiful about children's literature, which is queer, is that on the one hand it can be something very clear, like I have two daddies, I have two mommies, but it's also, it takes on very different forms and shapes. So in speaking about a small crayon, you're talking about very different kinds of things, because when you're very young, this is not all of what you want to be. You could just be someone who wants to play basketball and is not allowed to. And then later might realize you're a butch person. So these things add up retroactively. So these are some books that do exist, and so on.
I thought it was really interesting, the way, very compelling, the way you said that queer literature is always evolving. And, you know, and from where we are at different locations and different countries and different focal points of what's happening in the queer movement, we're responding to it. But I thought it was also important, I don't know what your name was? You made a really good, really interesting comment about, I think, the West and how queer literature has a very different meaning, and we're accessing it from a more middle class and above kind of way, the terminology, and then, you know, relating it back to the infrastructure, which is India, which is very different, which is very diverse. So I just thought that this kind of space is the start of something that allows just fighting back from feeling less and less shame from what is not mainstream. And I think that's the essentialness of queerness, is how you're able to express yourself, even if it means going completely against something that is what, you know, the mainstream expects of you. But thank you, this is such a wonderful collection, guys, Rohini and Sandbox. This itself, just having this here in this space, I think is so important to the culture of the space. Thank you. Anyone else? Comments, questions? Should we just start picking on people and say, what's your favorite book? Shout outs for recommendations. We do not have enough recommendations on the posters I've put out there. So things that you absolutely think, if there's one book that we buy tomorrow, what should it be? Come on, I know you have ideas. We already have one for 40 Rules of Love. Oh yes, please.
Oh, right.
No, shout.
Okay, there's one called The Lotteries by Julia Donaldson.
Julia Donaldson.
Huge family of two fathers, two mothers, one queer girl, one, I don't remember the story properly, but that's a beautiful book. And then we happened to read like Famous Five or something recently.
George.
Yes. So there's, I was like, oh my god, and my kids were like, phew. Okay, that's great when church says not here. And then there's another one called Boy in a Dress. I don't remember the author.
If you can write them down later, so that I will track them.
we can also continue to do this and get coffee and tea, and Kaavya will be here only for a while, so we can talk in public. Once again, Kaavya, thank you so much. I know you